5 years ago, Angela Brooks was abandoned with nothing but a cold note left on the kitchen table. No explanation, no final glance, just a few written lines that ended a love she once believed would last forever. Today, Richard Coleman, a powerful real estate tycoon, stepped onto his private jet with his young girlfriend. He thought he was heading toward a sweet weekend wrapped in luxury. Inside the elegant cabin, Richard lifted a glass of champagne, a confident smile playing on his lips. But fate has its own way of mocking men like him. The cockpit door suddenly opened, and his heart froze. The pilot was Angela. She was no longer the woman he once left behind in tears. Now she stood tall in her captain's uniform, strong, composed, unshaken, and beside her stood a little boy. His eyes sparkled with innocence, yet Richard saw in them a reflection too familiar to deny. Those eyes, that chin, the unmistakable echo of his own face. The past had never disappeared. It had only been waiting for this moment to return. Stay with us. Because what happens next will not only change Richard's life, but also touch the heart of anyone who has ever known loss and forgiveness. Richard leaned back into the leather seat, the hum of the jet's engine steady in the background. He raised his glass, the golden liquid catching the cabin light when his phone buzzed with a sharp vibration. He frowned. No one should have been contacting him now. The message had no name, no number, just a line of text that sliced through his composure. "She's in the cockpit, and so is your son." The words blurred before his eyes. For a moment he forgot to breathe. His hand trembled, and the glass slipped from his grip. Champagne spilled across the carpet, the crystal flute shattering with a sound too loud for the quiet cabin. Sophie turned her head quickly, startled by the noise. Richard muttered an excuse, his throat dry, but his mind screamed. Impossible, it could not be true. He had buried that chapter, sealed it with distance and silence. Yet the words glared back from the glowing screen, undeniable, mocking him. She? His son? His pulse quickened. He tried to steady his breath, but each inhale felt shallow. Slowly, like a man walking toward the gallows, Richard rose from his seat. He moved down the narrow aisle, each step heavy toward the cockpit door. Richard pushed the cockpit door open with sudden force, his body driven by something between panic and disbelief. The sight that met him froze every muscle. Angela sat at the controls, her uniform pressed, her posture confident. The calm authority of a pilot rested on her shoulders, but her eyes, sharp, steady, were colder than the altitude outside. No trace of the woman he had once known, no warmth left for him. Next to her sat a small boy in a miniature pilot's jacket, swinging his legs as if he belonged there. Dark curls framed his face, but it was the eyes that struck Richard like a blade. Those eyes mirrored his own, the same shape, the same depth, the same spark. The boy turned, curious, tilting his head in innocent fascination. Richard's breath caught. The world inside the cockpit seemed to shrink. The roar of engines faded, leaving only the pounding in his chest. Angela did not flinch. She did not greet him, nor accuse him. She simply sat, her hands firm on the controls, her silence louder than any word. Richard clung to the doorframe. He had imagined many futures, but never this one. Not her, not a child, not his reflection staring back. Angela's voice broke the silence, calm and professional, as if nothing had happened. "Mr. Coleman, you need to return to your seat. We are preparing for takeoff." Her tone held no tremor, no hint of emotion, though her eyes glinted with storms long contained. Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came. His throat burned. The weight of 5 years pressed on his chest. Then the boy turned fully, his small hand clutching a toy plane. His smile was bright, disarming. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "I'm Ethan. Do you like planes?" He held the toy up proudly, waiting for an answer. Richard felt the ground shift beneath him. The innocence in the child's voice cut deeper than any accusation. He wanted to speak, to claim, to deny, but his lips refused to move. Angela adjusted a switch, her gaze fixed forward. "Please, sir, for safety." The words carried authority, yet underneath lay an unspoken wall he could not cross. Ethan tilted his head again, puzzled by the silence of the stranger who looked so much like him. His wide eyes sparkled with curiosity, while Richard's own burned with guilt. He stepped back slowly, the door closing between them, his pulse echoing louder than the engines. Richard stumbled back down the aisle, his body moving but his mind adrift. The polished walls of the jet seemed narrower, pressing in around him. Every detail, the soft carpet, the leather seats, the faint scent of cologne, felt unreal, like a stage set for a nightmare. He dropped into his seat, his hands gripping the armrests as though to anchor himself. Sophie leaned closer, her eyes scanning his pale face. "Richard? What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." A ghost. Yes, that was exactly what it was. The ghost of choices made, the ghost of a woman abandoned, the ghost of a child he had never met. "I'm fine," he whispered, his voice rough. He forced a smile that fooled no one. "Just a little vertigo." Sophie studied him with concern, her hand resting lightly on his arm. But Richard could not meet her gaze. His eyes drifted back toward the cockpit door, closed now, holding behind it everything he had tried to forget. Inside his chest, a storm gathered, fierce and unrelenting. The life he had built on control and calculation trembled at its foundation. For the first time in years, Richard Coleman felt powerless. The engines roared, and the jet lifted smoothly into the night sky. Angela's voice filled the cabin, calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as we ascend." Her tone was steady, almost detached. Richard closed his eyes, but the sound of her voice cut through him. It dragged him backward in time. He remembered their last night together. Angela had spoken of a future, marriage, family, a home built on something deeper than money. She had looked at him with eyes full of trust. He had felt cornered, trapped by the weight of her hope. Fear had driven him. Not fear of her, but fear of what commitment demanded. So he did what came easiest. He disappeared. One morning, she had found only a note. Cold, brief, written with the precision of a man sealing a business deal. No goodbye, no explanation, just words on paper where promises used to be. Now, 5 years later, that note felt like a knife in his own chest. He opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling of the jet. The polished surface reflected nothing but emptiness. His own choices had carved the silence between them, and now the silence screamed back. The plane shuddered as a pocket of air jolted them. A soft ding signaled the seatbelt sign. Passengers murmured nervously. Sophie gripped Richard's arm, her knuckles pale. "Is everything all right?" she whispered, her fear raw. Richard nodded, forcing calm, though his own stomach twisted. He tried to focus on her, to reassure her, but his mind betrayed him. Again and again he saw the boy's face, the tilt of the head, the curve of the jaw, the unmistakable eyes. Each vibration of the aircraft mirrored the tremor inside him. Turbulence outside, turmoil within. He pressed a hand against his chest as if he could steady his racing heart by force. Angela's voice came again, firm and clear over the speakers. "We are encountering mild turbulence. Please remain calm and seated. This will pass shortly." She spoke as if she carried no weight, no memory, no storm. Richard envied her composure. Yet he wondered, was it real, or was it armor? He thought of Ethan, innocent, untouched by the shadows of his choices. A child carrying his blood, but none of his guidance. The plane steadied, but Richard's thoughts did not. His grip on Sophie's hand was firm, yet his soul drifted elsewhere. The turbulence eased, and quiet settled over the cabin. Richard tried to lose himself in the glowing screen of his tablet, but the numbers swam without meaning. He was barely breathing when a flight attendant leaned toward him, voice low. "Mr. Coleman, the captain requests your presence in the cockpit." His stomach dropped. Sophie lifted her brows. "That's unusual, isn't it?" she asked. Richard forced a thin smile. "Probably about arrival time." He unfastened his belt and rose, each step toward the cockpit feeling heavier than the last. The door opened, and inside he saw Angela at the controls, her expression carved from stone. Without turning, she said, "Ethan, honey, Carla will show you the rest of the plane." The boy looked up, excited, and hurried out with the attendant, his toy plane clutched in hand. Now there were only two. The hum of the instruments filled the space, yet the silence between them roared louder. Richard hesitated, caught between the urge to speak and the fear of what her eyes might hold. Angela adjusted a switch, still not looking at him. "Close the door." The click behind him felt final, like a lock sealing two souls in a cage of unfinished history. Angela's hands moved steadily over the controls, but her words cut sharp. "So," she said, her voice even, "the man who left me with nothing but a note now wants answers?" Richard swallowed, his throat dry. He wanted to speak, but she continued, her eyes still on the panel. "Do you know what it is to wake up to silence? To look for someone and find only paper? To carry a child alone, while the man responsible vanished without a trace?" Her voice did not rise. It carried no scream. but the quiet fury inside each syllable weighed heavier than shouting. Richard's chest ached. He tried to say her name, to form an apology, but the words caught like stones. He had faced hostile boardrooms, ruthless negotiations, collapsing markets, but this quiet reckoning, paralyzed him. Angela finally turned, her eyes green fire. "You left me to bear everything alone, and now you stand here shocked to see the truth you created." Richard's lips parted, but nothing came. His silence was confession enough. He lowered his gaze, ashamed, as the instruments beeped steadily, indifferent to the storm inside two human hearts. A soft alarm pulsed from the dashboard, breaking the tension. Angela's attention snapped back to the instruments. She scanned quickly, her movements precise. "What is it?" Richard asked, his voice tight. "Secondary hydraulics," she replied, professional, clipped. "Not catastrophic, but it requires inspection. We'll have to divert." Richard frowned. "Where?" "Charleston, South Carolina." Her tone carried no room for debate. The name hit him like another blow. Charleston. He had avoided that city, avoided everything tied to her, for years. Angela's gaze flicked to him for the briefest second, unreadable. "It has a suitable runway, good mechanics, and it happens to be home." Richard felt the ground shift beneath the illusion of control he had clung to. Every choice, every calculation, unraveled. The past was no longer distant. It was pulling him down toward the very place he had tried to erase. He sank into the co-pilot's seat, staring ahead at the horizon. The engines hummed steady, but inside him nothing was steady at all. Charleston awaited, and with it, answers he no longer had the strength to avoid. The jet rolled to a stop on the small Charleston runway. The door opened, and warm southern air rushed in. Ethan darted forward, clutching his toy plane. His voice rang clear, unburdened by the tension around him. "Home, Mommy!" The word pierced Richard. Home. This place, this small town he had avoided, was where his son had taken his first steps, spoken his first words, built his first dreams. Memories Richard had never witnessed lived here in abundance, etched into streets and walls he had never seen. Angela descended the stairs with calm certainty. She belonged here. Her stride held purpose, her hand steady on Ethan's shoulder. The boy skipped beside her, pointing at the hangar with excitement. Richard followed slowly, his polished shoes meeting the cracked tarmac. The contrast unsettled him. He had measured success in skyscrapers and penthouses, yet his bloodline had flourished quietly in this modest corner of the world. Sophie sighed audibly behind him. "This isn't what I imagined," she muttered, her voice dripping with disapproval. Richard didn't answer. His gaze stayed fixed on the boy. "Home, Mommy." The word echoed again, softer now, but it lingered, a truth he could not silence. His son's world had never needed him, until now. As they crossed the small terminal, a tall figure approached. His steps were slow but steady, guided by a wooden cane worn smooth by years of use. His hair was silver, but his eyes carried the sharpness of a man who had lived through storms. Ethan lit up. "Grandpa Harold!" He rushed into the man's embrace. Harold Brooks bent low, lifting the boy with surprising strength. The old man's smile warmed for Ethan, but when his gaze shifted to Richard, it hardened. "So, this is the famous Richard Coleman," Harold said. His voice was calm, yet layered with meaning. "Life has curious ways of arranging reunions." Richard extended a hand, but Harold did not take it immediately. Instead, he studied him, as though measuring his worth without words. Finally, he nodded, a small gesture of courtesy, and clasped Richard's hand with a grip stronger than expected. "You'll stay at our guest house tonight," Harold continued. "It isn't luxury, but it's honest shelter." Sophie bristled, her lips parting in protest, but Harold's eyes silenced her before she spoke. Richard said nothing. He felt both welcomed and judged, as if this man could see through polished suits and wealth to the hollow spaces beneath. The drive to the Brooks property was quiet. Trees lined the road, their branches arching like sentinels. Soon a colonial-style house appeared, paint weathered but well-kept, its porch wide and inviting. Flower beds framed the steps, their colors soft against the dusk. Inside, the air carried the scent of jasmine and wood polish. The furniture was simple, worn smooth by years of touch. Photographs in black and white lined the walls, faces of family, pilots in uniform, children with wide smiles. Sophie's expression faltered. She scanned the modest surroundings with thinly veiled disdain. Her voice dropped low as she leaned toward Richard. "This is charming," she said, though her tone betrayed disappointment. Ethan tugged Richard's sleeve eagerly. "Come see my room. It's full of planes." He pulled him down a hallway, walls decorated with more photographs. Some showed Angela younger, her arm around Harold, always near aircraft. They entered Ethan's room. It was a child's dream of flight. Models hung from the ceiling, a bed shaped like a cockpit, shelves stacked with books about aviation. Ethan's pride glowed. "Look, Mr. Coleman, this one is my favorite." Richard's throat tightened. The boy's joy clashed with the emptiness of years Richard had chosen to miss. Ethan placed a wooden model on Richard's palm, his eyes bright. "That's a Boeing. Mommy says one day I'll fly one for real." He beamed, then added softly, almost like sharing a secret, "My dad is a pilot too. He flies far away, so he can't be here." The words struck harder than any accusation. Richard froze, staring at the boy's trusting face. His chest tightened with a mix of shame and grief. The lie was gentle, crafted to protect innocence, but it revealed everything Richard had failed to be. Angela stood in the doorway, silent. Her arms were folded, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something unspoken. She did not correct the boy. She let the words linger, heavy and undeniable. Richard swallowed hard. He wanted to speak, to claim, to explain, but Ethan had already turned back to his models, humming softly, lost in the world of planes and possibilities. The silence stretched, thick with unasked questions. Richard met Angela's gaze across the room. She said nothing, yet her stillness spoke more than words. The weight of her choices and his absence hung between them like the suspended models overhead. Dinner was set on the porch overlooking a small lake, the table dressed with a simple linen cloth and china that had seen decades of meals. Candlelight flickered as evening deepened, casting warm shadows across familiar faces. Harold sat at the head, Ethan at his side, chattering about school and airplanes. Angela served with quiet efficiency, her eyes rarely lifting. Sophie sat stiff, polite but uneasy. Richard, across the table, barely touched his food. For a while only the sound of cutlery and Ethan's laughter filled the air. Then Harold's voice broke the silence, steady and deliberate. "Every choice we make," he said, gaze fixed on Richard, "creates waves. Those waves always return, no matter how far we think we've sailed." Richard shifted uncomfortably, his fork slipping against the plate. The words landed heavy, sharper than rebuke, softer than anger, truth disguised as wisdom. Sophie glanced at Richard, waiting for his response, but he had none. His throat closed around the words he could not form. Ethan leaned closer to Harold, asking about flight stories, breaking the tension with innocent curiosity. Yet Richard could not shake the echo. Waves always return, and his had just found their shore. The following afternoon, they walked through the quiet streets of Charleston. The town carried the charm of age. Brick paths, iron balconies, small shops with hand-painted signs. Ethan ran ahead, darting from one corner to the next, his laughter echoing down the narrow lanes. Angela walked at a steady pace, her eyes following her son with careful attention. Richard kept close, his gaze shifting between mother and child. For a fleeting moment it felt natural, as if they were a family simply enjoying a stroll. They stopped at a park. Ethan climbed the low stone wall, pretending it was the wing of a plane. Angela called out for caution, but her smile betrayed pride. Richard found himself smiling too, drawn into the illusion. He imagined a different past, one where he had not left, one where days like this had been real. The thought was bittersweet, a mixture of comfort and loss. As Ethan skipped back to them, Richard's hand brushed Angela's. It was accidental, brief, but it sent a current through him. She didn't flinch. She didn't linger either. The moment passed, but the ache remained. For the first time, Richard understood not just what he had lost, but what had never been allowed to begin. They paused at the steps of an old church. Its stone walls bore the weight of centuries, its bell tower rising against the pale sky. Angela leaned against the railing, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Her voice was calm, but the question cut sharp. "If you had known I was pregnant, would you have stayed?" Richard froze. The world narrowed to her words. The easy answer would have been yes, to soothe, to repair. But he couldn't lie. Not now. "I don't know," he admitted. His voice was low, raw. "Back then, I was not the man you needed. I was afraid of being tied, afraid of giving more than I knew how." Angela turned her face toward him, studying him with a gaze that pierced through excuses. There was no anger in her eyes, only disappointment softened by weariness. "I thought so," she said quietly. "At least you are honest now." The silence that followed pressed heavily. Ethan, unaware, tugged at her sleeve, pointing to a vendor selling wooden toys. Angela moved toward him, leaving Richard on the church steps, weighed down by the truth of his own cowardice. Honesty had freed him, but it also exposed how empty his choices had been. At the small market, Ethan's eyes sparkled at a stall filled with handmade toys. Wooden planes lined the table, each carved with care. He whispered to the vendor, then turned back, clutching one tightly. "Here," he said, holding it out to Richard. "Good luck, for someone special." Richard stared at the boy, stunned. The plane was small, simple, but in Ethan's hands it carried a weight greater than gold. His throat tightened. He reached out, and the toy rested in his palm, light yet heavy with meaning. "Thank you," Richard managed, his voice breaking. He wanted to say more, to tell the boy how much this gift meant, but words failed him. Ethan grinned, pleased with the exchange, and rushed back to Angela. She bent to kiss his hair, her expression softening as she glanced toward Richard. For a fleeting instant, her eyes seemed to say what her lips did not, that Ethan had given Richard more than just wood and paint. He had given him a chance. Richard held the plane as if it might vanish. It was no longer just a toy. It was a symbol, a quiet bridge built by a child between the man he was and the father he had yet to become. That evening, the Brooks guest house was lit with the soft glow of lamps. Richard sat in the living room, the wooden plane resting on the table before him. Ethan had gone to bed, his laughter lingering like a memory. The front door opened and footsteps echoed across the hall. Harold entered first, steady as ever. Behind him came a woman Richard knew instantly, though he hadn't expected her here. Catherine Coleman, his mother. Richard rose in shock. "Mother? What are you doing here?" Catherine's eyes softened briefly, then sharpened. "I came because the truth could no longer wait." She looked toward Sophie, who shifted uneasily by the doorway. Catherine stepped closer, her voice steady. "I was the one who asked Sophie to be in your life. She wasn't who you believed she was. She was there because I needed answers." Richard's heart pounded. The room tilted. "What are you saying?" Catherine did not flinch. "For 2 years, you thought you were in love. In reality, you were being observed. For your sake, for his sake." The words landed like a strike. Richard looked at Sophie, confusion turning to dread. His world, built on appearances, began to crack under his mother's revelation. Sophie lowered her gaze for a moment, then straightened, her expression stripped of charm. The warmth she had worn for 2 years fell away, leaving only steel. "My name isn't Sophie Carter," she said quietly. "It's Amanda. I'm a private investigator. Your mother hired me to find the truth about Angela, about Ethan." Richard staggered back, his breath catching. 2 years, he whispered. 2 years you played this role." Amanda did not flinch. "I did my job. I built a picture of you, of your habits, of your choices, and I brought you here because otherwise you would never have faced what you left behind." Richard shook his head, disbelief curdling into anger. Every smile, every touch, every whispered promise, all revealed as part of a design. "You used me," he said hoarsely. Amanda's eyes softened, though her voice remained firm. "I showed you who you are. Not the tycoon, not the billionaire, the man, the father. If that feels like betrayal, perhaps it's only because you refused to see yourself until now." The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard's hands trembled as he gripped the back of the chair. His world had not just cracked, it had collapsed. Richard's anger trembled in his hands, but Catherine's gaze held firm. She moved closer, her voice steady, every word measured. "You think this betrayal is mine," she said softly, "but it began long before. You are repeating the pattern of your father." Richard's jaw tightened. "Don't compare me to him." Catherine's eyes sharpened, yet sorrow shadowed them. "Arthur Coleman built towers, bought power, and destroyed lives. He left broken people behind him, even his own family. I swore you would not end the same way, alone, surrounded by wealth, but starved of love." The words struck deep. Richard's breath caught. His father's shadow loomed large, one he had spent his life trying to outrun. Yet now his mother placed him squarely in it. "I did this," Catherine continued, "because I will not bury another Coleman who died rich in money but poor in everything that matters." The silence thickened. Richard lowered his eyes, shame tightening in his chest. For the first time in years, he saw himself not as a titan of business, but as a man staring down the same emptiness that consumed his father. And he feared she was right. Morning light spilled across the guesthouse porch. Richard stepped outside, weary from a sleepless night. He stopped short at the sight before him. Catherine knelt in the garden, helping Ethan water a row of flowers. The boy's laugh was light, pure, carrying in the cool air. When he looked up at her, his eyes wide with admiration, he said the word that stopped Richard's breath. "Grandma." Catherine froze, then smiled, the kind of smile Richard hadn't seen in decades. She pulled the boy close, pressing a kiss to his hair. "Yes, Ethan, I am your grandma." The words wrapped around Richard like a blade and balm together. He watched them, his mother, who had fought to protect him, and his son, who had grown without him, bonding as if the years of absence meant nothing. Ethan held Catherine his hand, tugging her to see his toy plane. She followed willingly, her laughter mingling with his. Richard stood still, his chest aching. He wanted to step forward, to join them, but his feet would not move. It was too natural, too effortless, and he was the outsider. Yet, hearing that word, Grandma, forced him to face the truth. His family already existed, with or without him. Later, Richard found Angela at the kitchen table, papers scattered, a half-finished cup of coffee cooling by her side. She didn't look up when she spoke. "You want answers? Here's one." Richard waited. "I've been writing to your mother for 3 years," Angela said quietly. "Letters. Real letters. She found me. She asked, and I let her in." Richard's chest tightened. "You've spoken to her all this time, and never to me?" Angela finally met his eyes. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. "Because you made it clear I was unwanted. She wanted Ethan to have a chance to know more than just absence." The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. Richard gripped the back of a chair. "So, you conspired?" "No," Angela replied firmly. "We hoped one day you'd stop running. Hoped you'd face what you abandoned. That's all." Her words left no space for defense. Richard lowered his eyes to the coffee ring staining the table, a small human mark in a life he had kept sterile and controlled. Angela had built honesty out of his silence, connection out of his void. And for the first time he realized his mother and Angela had given his son what he had refused. That night, Amanda approached Richard on the porch. She leaned against the railing, her face stripped of pretense, her voice quiet but sharp. "You have an empire," she said. "Buildings that scrape the sky, wealth that commands rooms. But tell me, when you return to your penthouse, who listens to your day? Who cares if you wake in the night?" Richard turned his face away, his jaw locked. Amanda didn't stop. "You mistake control for meaning. You think being untouchable is power, but I've watched you. 2 years of dinners, flights, parties. Every story you told was about money, or deals, or yourself, never about connection, because there was none." Her words pressed into him, each one a mirror he could not escape. His silence confirmed her truth. "You call this betrayal," Amanda said, "but I call it exposure. Now you see what the world already knows. Your life is empty, until you decide to fill it." Richard's fists tightened against the railing. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but when he closed his eyes, all he saw was Ethan's face. Innocent, expectant, and the weight of Amanda's words was undeniable. The empire meant nothing if no one shared it. The next morning, Ethan climbed onto Richard's lap as if it were the most natural thing. His small hands toyed with the wooden plane. He looked up, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Are you my dad?" The question was simple, unguarded. Richard froze. The world seemed to fall silent. Angela, across the room, tensed but did not interfere. She watched, waiting. Richard's throat tightened. His hands shook as he rested them on Ethan's shoulders. "Yes," he whispered, his voice raw. "Yes, I am your dad." Ethan blinked, studying him as though weighing the answer. "Then why weren't you here?" Richard swallowed hard. His chest ached. "Because I was a coward. I was afraid. I thought running was easier than staying." He forced himself to meet the boy's gaze. "But I don't want to run anymore. I want to be braver now." Ethan considered this, his small brow furrowed. Then he nodded once, solemn. "Okay, but no more running." Richard pulled him close, his eyes burning. The boy's warmth pressed into him. Forgiveness offered with the simplicity only a child could give. And for the first time in years, Richard felt hope stir where only emptiness had lived. Richard spent the day beside Ethan. Morning began at the kitchen table. The boy bent over his homework, tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth in concentration. Richard leaned close, helping with math problems, amazed by the boy's sharpness. Later, they walked to the park. Ethan raced ahead, explaining the mechanics of flight with the certainty of a child who believed anything was possible. Richard listened, not out of obligation, but out of genuine wonder. Each word, each laugh, was a lesson money could never buy. They built a paper plane together. Richard launched it clumsily, and Ethan laughed until his stomach hurt. "You're supposed to fold it tighter, Dad," he said. The word "Dad" rolled through Richard like sunlight breaking storm clouds. In the evening, Richard read aloud from a book about pilots. Ethan leaned against him, eyes heavy, until he drifted asleep mid-sentence. Richard stayed still, the boy's weight warm against his side. For the first time in years, he felt something richer than any deal he had closed. He realized he had spent a lifetime chasing numbers when the true wealth was resting quietly in his arms. That night, Catherine sat with Richard by the lake, the moonlight rippling across the water. Her voice was calm, but her words carved deep. "There is something you don't know," she began. "Your father had another child before you, a son. He abandoned him, just as he abandoned us in different ways." Richard stiffened. "What are you saying?" Catherine sighed, her gaze lost in memory. "When you were 12, a boy named Rodrigo needed a bone marrow transplant. He was 3 years older than you. Tests proved he was your half-brother. Your father refused to help. He denied it to the grave." The revelation hit Richard like cold water. His chest constricted, his father's shadow growing darker. The pattern was undeniable. Generations of absence, generations of cowardice. Rodrigo survived, though with scars. He became a professor, built a life of his own, but the wound remained. And now, Richard? Catherine turned her eyes on him, steady and unrelenting. "You stand at the same crossroads. Repeat your father, or break free." Richard's throat burned. For years he had feared becoming his father. Now the truth was clear. He already was, unless he chose differently. The next day, Angela met Richard on the porch. Her arms were crossed, her eyes steady, unflinching. "Ethan doesn't need a weekend dad," she said plainly. "He doesn't need gifts, or appearances, or half-hearted promises. He needs presence, stability, courage." Richard's chest tightened. "I want to be here." Angela shook her head. "Words are easy. You've spoken them before. What matters is action. Will you break the cycle? Or will you vanish again when the world demands too much?" Her voice didn't rise. It was calm, firm, but it struck harder than shouting. Richard felt the weight of her gaze pressing him to the truth. "I can't risk letting you close only to watch you disappear," Angela added, her eyes softening only for a moment. "Ethan deserves better than that." Richard struggled for breath. He wanted to promise, to swear, but he knew promises alone meant nothing. The ultimatum left no middle ground. Either step into fatherhood fully, or step away forever. His silence lingered. Angela turned, walking back inside. Richard remained rooted on the porch, the choice hanging heavy over him. For the first time, the empire he built felt meaningless compared to the one fragile bond waiting for his courage. Days later, Richard stood before a crowd of reporters. Cameras flashed, questions flew. His company's board had urged silence, denial, control, but Richard no longer wanted silence. He stepped to the microphone, his heart pounding. "I am here to acknowledge what I once ran from," he began. "This is my son, Ethan Brooks, and I am his father." The crowd erupted. Some gasped, others scribbled furiously. Richard continued, voice steady. "For years, I built towers and fortunes, but I neglected what mattered most. I will not hide anymore. I will not repeat the mistakes of those before me." Behind him, Catherine stood firm, and Angela held Ethan's hand. The boy's eyes were wide but calm, watching his father stand in the storm. Questions about scandal, shares, investors rattled through the air, but Richard no longer feared them. The empire could shake, the headlines could scream, but the truth gave him strength. He stepped away from the podium, ignoring the chaos. For the first time, he felt lighter. Public redemption was not the end. It was only the beginning. Weeks later, Richard sat in the co-pilot's seat of a small Cessna. Angela guided the controls with ease, while Ethan sat behind them, eyes shining. "Ready?" Angela asked, glancing at him. Richard nodded, hands trembling slightly as he touched the yoke. The plane steadied under his grip. His heart raced, but this time not with fear, with awe. "Dad is flying," Ethan shouted, his voice bright, echoing through the headset. Richard smiled, eyes damp. The boy's joy filled the cabin, louder than the engines, more powerful than any fortune Richard had ever amassed. For the first time he was not fleeing, not hiding. He was here, present, steering forward. Angela's gaze softened as she watched him. Not forgiveness, not romance, but respect. A recognition that he had chosen to change. The horizon stretched wide before them, open and endless. Richard felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by the fragile strength of possibility. Money and fame can lift a man high, but only love keeps him from falling. What do you think? Can love and responsibility truly give Richard a chance to begin again? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that touch the heart.